Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for January 31st, 2023. It's right there in front of you. Spoiler alert, in The Sixth Sense, Bruce Willis is dead for almost the entire movie. Okay, be mad at me. But I think the spoiler statute of limitations has passed on this one after nearly 25 years. If you were to watch it today, knowing this information, it would be patently obvious. It might not even be that good of a movie. It's staring you in the face from the very start. I mean, no one survives a gut shot like the one Bruce takes in the opening scene, right? By the way, narrator's note, please don't even try. Even seemingly insignificant details in that movie and in anything else are important, especially in the context of a larger story. And the same is true with data. Sometimes data is so basic that we just gloss over it and it doesn't even register as important. But every piece of data matters in some context, right? You just need to tell its story. So I wanted to resurface a pretty basic finding from our most recent survey, Safe and Sound, to see what we can learn from what else podcast listeners stick into their earballs. Now, the sample for Safe and Sound comprised 1,093 interviews with Americans 18 plus who would listen to a podcast in the last month, which is the broadest screen I would look at for a viable look at the current audience for podcasting. While the questions we asked in Safe and Sound were generally related to brand safety and brand suitability, we always ask some hygiene-level questions, basic media usage, demographics, things like that, to get a read on the sample and make sure that we're talking to the right people. Among those questions are a few simple queries about what else podcast fans listen to over the course of an average month or week. Now, keeping in mind that the entire sample of this study were monthly podcast listeners, which means 100% have listened in the last month. Among those questions are a few simple queries about what else podcast fans listen to over the course of an average month or week. Now, keeping in mind that the entire sample are monthly podcast listeners, which means 100% of them have listened to at least one podcast in the last month, let's compare that to what they tell us they listen to in the last week to see what we can tease out. Number 1, 76% of the time, they work all the time. Reassuringly at the top of the list for what monthly podcast listeners listen to in a week, of course, are podcasts. Now, the first thing you will notice if you check out the graph for this is that this number is not 100%. 100% of monthly podcast listeners do not listen to podcasts in an average week. It's 76%. Now, it couldn't be 100%, not really. Even the most rabid podcast listener occasionally misses a week here or there due to life's intrusions. Some listeners are potentially fans of only one or maybe two shows. And if those shows take a week off, so do they. I think there are more of this type of podcast listener than you might think. I think a lot of Joe Rogan's listeners are like that, by the way. Things like vacation can also disrupt media consumption, though if you're watching White Lotus while you're staying at a White Lotus, you might be doing it wrong, but who am I to judge? But here's the thing. The gap between 100%, those who are monthly listening in this sample, and 76%, the weekly listening, that can't entirely be explained by vacation. 24% of American podcast listeners weren't on vacation last week. This is not how we put humans on the moon or subwoofers in movie theater seats and countless other innovations. No, for some portion of that gap, which is millions of humans, podcasting is not yet a habit. And we can't assume it will ever be so. We can't just assume that they'll grow into it. This is the first opportunity podcasting has to gain a deeper foothold into the psyche of our fellow travelers. We need to promote the medium as much as we promote our own shows. If we can't even get our own tribe to come back week after week, then how will we ever reach the great unpodcasted masses of America and beyond? Now, I'm really tired of the cliche low-hanging fruit. The only low-hanging fruit that I truly value are the low-bush blueberries of down East Maine, the lands and fruits of my people. But the 24% of the monthly podcast listeners who didn't listen to a podcast last week are the next best thing to blueberries. Again, I suspect many of those listeners are really just fans of one show, and we can't count on Meghan Markle to promote other podcasts. It would be nice, though. One of the things that we are making a central part of our mission this year at Sounds Profitable is to find ways to tell the story of our medium outside of our medium to the advertising and entertainment industries at large. We talk to ourselves a lot in podcasting. We need to visit the neighbors. Number 2, the new TV. Number 2 on our list of what monthly podcast consumers listen to in an average week are music videos on YouTube at 58%. Now, I've spoken and written at length about YouTube, and I'm not going to retread too much of that ground here. You belong on YouTube. It's the greatest content search and discovery engine on the planet. That does not necessarily mean that your podcast, in its present form, belongs on YouTube. It may not do that well in that fashion. But if you want to reach 18 to 34s in this country especially, YouTube is the TV set. You want to at least have a presence there, even if only in a promotional capacity. I do want to point out the specificity of this particular data point, though. It's not just YouTube. It's music videos on YouTube. The Tube is, in fact, one of the most widely listened to on-demand music services on the planet. There are still executives in the media industry who have not gotten their heads around the fact that people actually listen to YouTube without watching YouTube. Those executives, by the way, will soon be replaced by ChatGPT. But the point I really want to make here is that podcasts and music, they kind of go together. And after podcasts, music on YouTube is the second most popular destination for our listeners. And as I have said, music as a podcasting category, and not just podcasts playing music, by the way, which can legally be as fatal as a Bruce Willis gutshot. Music as a podcasting category is the great blue ocean for podcasts. And that's why YouTube megastar Rick Beato is so successful. Look him up. He's making videos breaking down the songs that you're already on YouTube to listen to. His shows get recommended to you right there on the right-hand column every time you visit the site to listen to these classic songs. Now, Rick is amazingly talented, and he has also discovered that his talent, combined with the ability to draft off of the search results for some of the most popular rock songs in the world, is a magical combination. Now, he would not be this successful were he not that good, and his stuff is really good. But he has also taken advantage of the real strength of YouTube, discovery, in a powerful and organically sustainable way. Now, back in the blogozoic era of this planet, blogging consultants used to tell you to research Google search trends and keywords to discover niche topics to blog about that people were already searching for. And this, my friends, is that. This might be the one idea from this newsletter and podcast that makes it worth the price this week, which I will reiterate is free. Number 3, the oft misreported death of the radio star. At number 3 on this week's countdown is the great undiscovered country for podcasts, or podcasts that aren't owned by broadcast radio groups anyway, AM/FM radio, which was listened to in the last week by 53% of monthly podcast consumers. Now, here is where knowing your audience and their other interests can be truly valuable. Have you seen how cheap it is to advertise on AM/FM radio lately? Now, while I don't think podcasting can be beat in terms of engagement, brand lift, brand fit, and other get-you-to-buy measures, broadcast radio is pretty tough to top in terms of economical reach and frequency. After all, iHeart basically built their entire app on the backs of broadcast radio promotion, and they've been able to do the same to drive trials of selected podcasts like The Ron Burgundy Show. Now, this is also available to you. If your podcast is about finance, have you looked into advertising on any local or national radio programs about money, or parenting, or health? You might be surprised at how attainable building reach is for you in this way. It's at least worth running a trial and comparing it to the relative performance of podcast player ads or Facebook ads. You are at least reaching people who listen to things. Heck, I'm a bigger believer in billboards and other out-of-home advertising options than I am some online ads. Find out who your people are, then find out where you can reach more people like them and reach them where they are. For 53% of monthly podcast listeners, where they are is also AM/FM radio, and you'd better believe that, regardless of your own personal media consumption habits. Now, the next three items on this list of things that podcast consumers have listened to, I won't spend a lot of time on. It's internet-only radio at 43%, followed by owned music at 28%, and music channels on your TV at 23%. Now, certainly advertising on Pandora or ad-supported Spotify or some of the other internet-only radio services is another available angle here at entry number 4. And entries number 5 and 6, owned music, which continues to shrink, and TV music channels, those are less available to you. But I want to close here on the last two items on this list, SiriusXM satellite radio at 22%, and audiobooks at 21%. Number 4, breaking the model. Now, I know how people read graphs like the one that I'm talking about today. They look at the things on the bottom and they say to themselves, look how small those are in comparison. Well, selves, you'd be wrong to look at SiriusXM that way. Here's how to look at that 22%, as in 22% of monthly podcast consumers listened to SiriusXM last week. Here's how to look at that in context. More than 1 in 5 podcast listeners pay a subscription fee every month to hear music and talk, even though YouTube Music and many streaming channels and AM/FM radio and podcasts are free. Now, I've paid that fee every month since XM Radio launched their first creaky bird into the sky and turned on their transmitters back in 2001. Doing the math, I think I've paid XM and then SiriusXM somewhere around, I'm not good at math, $1 million. But this isn't an ad for SiriusXM. The point I want to make here is that people are conditioned today to spend money on the content they love. If you're making content people love, and not just background listening, I mean content that people love, there is ample evidence to support the fact that people will pay for that content, and they'll pay regularly for it. Now, there are many things that Americans are not spending as much money on as they used to, right? They're not spending as much money on fine dining. They're not spending money going to the movies. They're not spending as much money on R. Kelly albums. That excess entertainment dollar is now going towards personal and in-home content, and that SiriusXM number I would submit is Exhibit A that podcast listeners don't just listen to things because they're free. And finally, nearly tied with SiriusXM at 21%, we have audiobooks, another industry I've been privileged to serve for many years. This is a number that I would submit is also high and could even be higher. Again, remember that these data are for weekly consumption. It's weekly consumption of an audiobook. And with a noticeable chunk of the current audience for audiobooks commuting less than they used to, which curtails in-car listening, which is a big category for audiobooks, there are still a lot of podcast listeners who are also making time for audiobooks in their weekly diet. Now, there are a lot of synergies between these two channels. As I've said before, S-Town was basically an audiobook brought to you by meal delivery services. And Malcolm Gladwell has also blurred the lines between the two, and I think rather successfully. Podcasts could be seen as the gateway drug to buying audiobooks, but actually, I think they're symbiotic. I think it kind of goes both ways. I see the potential to package them together in single-focused apps that are relevant to a particular genre or topic. I see different revenue models for audiobooks, accelerated by Spotify's acquisitions over the past couple of years, but also by changing consumer habits. I see rich potential for audio drama to cross the streams here and become even bigger than it is. And as I wrote last year, I see continued development on a third thing, particularly in nonfiction, that bridges the gap between podcasts and audiobooks. And most of all, as in the previous point I just made about SiriusXM, people pay for audiobooks with cash or an audiobook credit, which they paid for. There will continue to be multiple revenue streams for podcasting, from direct response and performance marketing to brand advertising to direct listener support and beyond. Some people will never pay for audio content, and that's fine. We can sell them mattresses. But some people will pay, and pay a lot, for exactly the thing that makes them happy. And if you make the thing that makes them happy, don't be afraid to charge for it. In fact, don't be afraid to break the model. There is no model. I appreciate your sticking with me as I walk through a seemingly basic graph to highlight the deeper stories within it. My ex-wife is a microbiologist who works at a university on infectious disease, and she always used to tell me there was no such thing as basic science. There was only science that had yet to be applied. And this is true of nearly every data point in podcasting. And in this space over the coming months, I'm going to be applying myself to that very issue. Thanks for listening. And if you know someone who might find these insights valuable, why not pass this podcast along? Tell a friend. And be sure to subscribe to Sounds Profitable at soundsprofitable.com, and I will try not to spoil any more movies. This episode was put together with the help of Spooler. Thank you, Spooler, and hosted by the fine folks at Art19. This has been, it's right there in front of you, the Sounds Profitable article for January 23rd, 2023. I'm Tom Webster, and I'll see you next time.